Hello everybody, it is Kirsty. You know me, I solve crimes using astrology. If you don't know me, then you've just found my channel. I've got tons of videos to watch and tell everybody about it because it's pretty interesting. Okay, so tonight I'm going to have a look at a very topical point, obviously. The death of George Floyd. As you'll see here, I've got Rodney King, we've got riot things, the police officers, etc. What we're going to do is not just look at the chart of the death of George Floyd and Rodney King. We're going to look at them in the perspective of cycles throughout history. It's the most important thing that I could possibly big ant on me again, sorry. It's the only thing that I could drill into you so much. If I had to drill one thing into you, it is please learn cycles. And you have to go way back through history as well, because when you start learning cycles, astrology just becomes undeniable. I know that this is an awful topic. Black lives do matter. But black lives don't matter. But there's a deeper thing underneath all of this. Like I said, it's cyclical. It's time. Time changes things. When America formed its constitution and did its Declaration of Independence in 1776, 246 years ago, everything was so different back then. The same as in the Commonwealth in the UK, in Rome, in Greece, and everywhere. Everything was completely different. I don't quite understand why all of our countries are using documents and laws and legalities, policies, government and everything that was made over 200 years ago in some places. So my point is, we need to reassess everything. We're in a brand new age. It's time for this bullshit to stop. And maybe, just maybe, if certain people could understand that this type of thing is cyclic, but it's going to change, then people can just get to the change quicker, and we can stop all this rioting and all this unnecessary killing of anybody. It's a dream of mine that happens, but you know, maybe it's just that utopian vision. Anyway, before I get right into these charts, and it's going to be a long one, I think, grab a cup of coffee, cup of tea, get your cigarettes, get your notepad, get whatever you need, grab your joint, grab whatever it is that you want to do, because, hey, it's your life. But still grab a notebook, because even though it's your life, if you want to learn astrology, get yourself a notebook. That's my Virgo talking in there. I'm not a Virgo, I have some Virgo. Okay, so before we talk about racial violence, I want to address a couple of things. Please do not write to me and tell me that Barry Morphew is the bridge guy that killed Libby and Abby. I just can't deal with it anymore. There's no way on this planet I will give everybody my hat if Barry Morphew did anything, let alone killed Libby and Abby. It just didn't happen. And another thing, I didn't put any of my opinion into Madeleine McCann's chart. The chart says what the chart says. So if you can scream at me as much as you want that the mum and dad did it, it doesn't matter what I think or what you think, it's what the charts say. And also, I do not believe in blood sacrifices and rituals. Now, there's only ever been a handful of satanic murders, and those murders occur because one or two psychotic individuals decide that they think they're vampires, or they think they're immortal, or whatever, and decide that they think they can do bloodletting and whatnot. I'm here to tell you right now, satanic murdering of children, it just doesn't happen. And everybody that's telling me that they think Jerry and Kate McCann satanically bloodletted their child or did something like that, I actually can't deal with it. So please don't write any more on my YouTube page about it. I went through the West Memphis 3 case very heavily, and actually with many members of the family, and even with the 3 boys that were falsely accused. And the amount of satanic panic and satanic bullshit that I've heard, I have learnt now enough about it to know that it barely exists. Just because there's a cross somewhere, or a Star of David, or an inverted pentagram, or whatever anybody thinks it is, anywhere or whatever, doesn't mean people sacrifice babies and children. And I'll put my point across even more. Satanists don't believe in that type of thing, and I'm very passionate about that. So even if you have a Satanist standing in front of you and you had a discussion with them about this, they would say, "What are you talking about? Why would I kill a child?" So it's nonsense. Please don't talk to me about bloodletting, blood sacrifices, sacrificing children, sacrificing multiple children. Look, I don't know who killed Madeleine McCann, but can you imagine all the people that wrote in my comments that her parents did it? Imagine just for 1 second that you were in their shoes and you didn't do it. And you sat there and you read that type of stuff. You read that people say that they killed their teeny little baby daughter, bloodletted her, and sacrificed her to some demon, some god, and then went and did it to other children as well. I think it's actually disgusting, and I don't tolerate. No, Madeleine McCann wasn't sacrificed by some demon-loving Satanist. So please, please don't write that stuff to me. I'm a sensible human being. Just because I do astrology doesn't mean I believe in that sort of stuff. I believe in evidence and science, and I believe in astrology. I've got common sense. I don't believe in ritual sacrifices. So enough with that. Let's move on. Alright, as always, here's a bunch of charts. Now, I was asked by a lovely person in one of the comments why all the blue and red lines are there. Now, they're actually there because they show me the planets' correlation to each other. So these red lines are 90 degrees. It shows me that the planets are 90 degrees away from each other. These blue lines show me that the planets are 60 degrees away from each other. This long blue line shows me that the planets are 120 degrees away from each other. And I need to know those things. But in this instance, I've turned the orb, so it's the orb, and it's written up here, right down to 20%. So we've only got the very tightest aspects here. So then I can draw on them and we can have a good look. Right, first off, 3rd of March 1991, we have the beating of Rodney King at 12:53 a.m. in Los Angeles. That's this chart. The second chart is when the officer, he's not an officer, he's just a scumbag, when the scumbag knelt on George's neck, 8:24 p.m., 25th of May. This is that chart, and then George succumbed to those violent injuries and died at 9:24, 1 hour later, and that's this chart here. So we're going to have a look at all of them. Now, first thing is, you'll see this obviously. This is Sagittarius. So let me just grab a pen. We don't want it in white. This symbol here, oops, the line is Sagittarius. Now that's Rodney King, George Floyd, Sagittarius. George Floyd, Sagittarius. Okay? All three have Sagittarius rising, and Gemini, which is this one here. The two lines with two more lines. Gemini there, Gemini there, Gemini there. So very interestingly, we have the same ascendant and descendant for when Rodney King was beaten and when George Floyd was violently knelt on. That is nothing in comparison to what else I'm going to show you though. So let's have a look firstly at, okay, first we're going to have a look at each individual chart and have a little talk about them. Then please watch all the way through, because I'm going to talk about cycles and how in 1991 Saturn is virtually at exactly the same position it is this week. So keep watching, because that only happens once every 30 years. So the chances of Saturn being in Aquarius for both of these events was not slim, because it's cyclic. Like I said, everything is cyclic. But you're going to want to hear about it. It is very, very interesting. And look, they even sit in the same area. So keep watching for the full deep dive at the end of it to show the cyclic differences and similarities and what's going to happen moving forward. But for now, we're going to have a look at Rodney King to start with. So on the 3rd of March 1991 at 12:53, you may, if you're old enough like me, you might remember the footage. I remember it very clearly. 12:53 p.m, March the 3rd, 91. Rodney was pulled over by the LAPD for speeding on a freeway. He admitted later on that he was trying to get away because he'd been drinking and was on probation for robbery. He was pulled off of the freeway, eventually stopped his car in front of a San Fernando Valley apartment building, and it was at that point that the LAPD took over. Another guy, George Holiday, who lived in the apartment building, was woken up by the noise and came out with the videotape, the infamous videotape, filming 4 of these white police officers beating and kicking Rodney King dozens of times. Like, they laid into him so badly. You can see that here. They really took him out. When George Holiday gave the video to the TV station, it caused outrage all over the world. Very, very similar to what's happened with George. So I've just got a bit of a timeline here. So on the 15th of March, a Los Angeles County grand jury indictment is unsealed, charging the 4 officers seen in the video. So initially the same, it was okay, yes, they're being charged. These officers, Sergeant Stacy Kuhn, Theodore Brizino, Lawrence Powell and Timothy Wind, all pled not guilty. Their trial was moved to Simi Valley, California, which was an all-white suburb, which is ridiculous to do, but I suppose I get it. People have the right to a fair trial. On the 29th of April in 1992, after 7 days, the jury actually acquitted almost all of the charges. And then after the verdict was read, that was it. The world just went absolutely bullshit, apeshit, angry. Like it says, they exploded in anger, burning, looting shops by the hundreds and attacking non-black passers-by, and probably, this seems a little bit biased. I copied this, by the way, it's not my timeline. Again, a similar thing on the third day. Rodney King himself asked for peace, same as George Floyd's family. Then they had a curfew, the same as what's going on here. The police chief was put up, mind you, this is going on a couple of years later. That should say 92, I think. It took 1 year for them to riot. Here's a riot. They did certainly riot. The police chief was under heaps of pressure and resigned after 43 years. He should have been charged. That's crazy. But that's actually the thing that I'm going to be talking about. It's the evolution of time and how things do change, and also astrologically what I see, which I'm of course going to show you in a second. Okay, so it just goes on. They are actually, in 1994, 2 of them are sentenced to prison. One dies, that old guy died of cancer, and then sadly on the 17th of June 2012, Rodney King himself drowned in his own backyard at the age of 47. So that's just really so sad. But let's have a look at his chart for the time that he was caught on video being beaten, and then in comparison to George Floyd's chart, and let's see what's going on there. Here we have Rodney King's. So the 3rd of March 1991, 29 years ago. For those of you that know astrology, probably know where this is heading. What happens every 29 years? Saturn does a full revolution around the sun. So we'll zoom in. Oh, I did it. I'm going to zoom in really close here. So when Rodney King was beaten, the ascendant here was at 11 degrees of Sagittarius. We've got to remember that. Saturn is at, there's Saturn there, 2 degrees of Aquarius. Whoops. Okay, you can see that down here too. Here's Saturn, 2 degrees 40 minutes and 44 seconds of Aquarius. So always remember, you can look down in this thing here, and you can learn the symbols here and also see the exact figures, numbers. Okay, so just focusing on the fact that we've got the Sagittarius rising, and Sagittarius is ruled by Jupiter. That's in the 8th house of death in Leo. That's there. So we're only looking at 2 things. The ascendant, which is Rodney King, his ruler, which is, oops, not there, Jupiter up there. Get it right. In the 8th house. Predominantly we're looking at Saturn here in the 2nd, oh, this pen's so bad, in the 2nd house in Aquarius, these wavy lines. That's Rodney King. Now we're going to move right over to George Floyd. Okay, so this is, hang on, sorry, I'll just grab my pen. Here's George Floyd's death. 9:24 p.m. I'm going to zoom in. We'll go close like that. Now, the ascendant, George Floyd, once again, Sagittarius, 13 degrees Sagittarius, so close. The ruler of Sagittarius, as we know before, is Jupiter. Now that is sitting down here in this second house, right next to Saturn in Aquarius at nearly 2 degrees. It is in the same spot. It took 29 years to the week to get it around to exactly the same spot. That is what a cycle is. So what's the cycle showing us? Firstly, it's very interesting that George, the ruler of the victim, is right next to Saturn at this point in time. Saturn is authority, the police, the government, the structure of the government, the structure of the world basically, and his body, his physical body. And it's right next to himself. Now, so this 30-year cycle that's occurred, Rodney's Jupiter, the ruler of his, was right up in the 8th house, away. And it wasn't near Saturn. It was opposite Saturn, in fact. This time, George is represented by Jupiter, and he's right next door to Saturn. So everybody got onto this immediately. Absolutely immediately. It didn't take a year like it did with Rodney King. It was very fast. And I believe that that's because Jupiter, the ruler of George, is right next to Saturn, which is at exactly the same spot as it was where it was with Rodney King. Now, the 4 officers got away with it for a long time. And that's understandable because officers are also represented by Saturn. They're the authority. They're the people that are supposed to protect us. This time, the repercussions were very immediate. Charged. Guilty. They're done. Unless something happens in a year's time and we find that they get off of it or something, but I highly doubt it. So, another thing that's interesting with that, so not only is this cyclic and has occurred exactly 29 years after the last beating and riot in exactly the same way, there's a couple of other things that are similar, but also other things that show that we're moving ahead at this point in time. So it's as bad as it is, it will get better. Sagittarius and Jupiter in astrology always represent foreign lands, foreign people, and people of colour. Now, this is going back to the beginning of astrological time. In astrology, you can deem any culture as being ruled by Jupiter and Sagittarius because it's cultural as well. So not just colour, but culture too. So this Sagittarius on both Rodney King and George's ascendant shows that colour is the problem with the police. And we know that, but it shows that. So there's prejudice against colour. And that's very clear here. The second house in an astrology chart, so this is George Floyd's. Now, just bear with me one second. This is Rodney King's. Okay, so there we have the Sagittarius, but he's right up here in an exact opposition. Jupiter at 4 degrees is opposite Saturn, in Leo and Aquarius. So instead of being conjunct, they're opposite. We've got 2 cycles now. We have a Jupiter cycle, Jupiter opposite Saturn and Jupiter conjunct Saturn. When Rodney King had his day in court and those arseholes got away with it, it's because he's up here in just away from them, you know, like if he was right here, Jupiter was right there like it was with George Floyd, it would have made more impact. Jupiter wasn't in the right spot, so it didn't do the job. It continued. Police violence continued. Okay, again, this one is again still in the 2nd house. Now, what I was going to say before is the 2nd house is the area of life that represents self-worth, confidence, feeling valued within one's self, feeling happy with one's own appearance, the way a person dresses, and you know, someone likes to wear a lot of jewelry and stuff like that. That's 2nd house stuff. It's all about how we value ourselves, and the 8th house, which is opposite in Rodney King's chart here, the 8th house is how we value other people, so they should go hand in hand. Okay, so it should be the police officers should value him and he should value them, etc., etc. But in George Floyd's case, it's a very heavy 2nd house. It's like it was very obvious that the police officer, which was Saturn, and Jupiter, which was next door, right here, it shows that this police officer had no regard for George Floyd's life at all. I mean, we know that, but he had no regard even for his own self-worth, his own values in life. Happily sitting there kneeling on his neck. You know, and what's also interesting is them being so close. It's almost like the police officer in retrograde, mind you, so going backwards, heading towards George Floyd. It is almost like he took his racism out on George Floyd. I have to say that. But because it's in the 2nd house of values and what we value, the world wasn't going to take it. So the riots started very quickly. I don't know what rioting will ultimately achieve and if it will, but my thing is that when Saturn leaves Aquarius and goes backwards and heads back towards Jupiter and Pluto, the government is going to have to restructure. In some way, there's just has to be some restructuring. And all of this here tells me that it wasn't going to happen in 1991 when Saturn was last in Aquarius. We weren't that far advanced. Police didn't want to change. Racism was too rife. The thin blue line was too thin. I don't know. But now some police are good. Some police are absolutely shocking, but some are good. So we need to understand and understand what we value most. That's very, very easy to see, and that's just from looking at Jupiter and Saturn, and I think I've talked for 20 minutes about that already. So let's have a look at George's rest of the chart. So Gemini is on the enemy's side, the public enemy, the police in this instance. Now, when he was dying, this is when he was dead, sorry, he was being looked after by somebody, and I imagine that could have been a woman. So, in fact, I'm going to swap back to the other chart. Okay, here we have when the police dude was stepping on his neck. So everything is still in the second house there, as I was explaining. I'll just zoom in. So now this shows us more like what happened. We still have Gemini here, but the Sun is sitting on the DC here. That's a male, and a male in authority as well. That's the policeman, basically. And then back here, Mercury in Gemini and Venus in Gemini, and the North Node in Gemini, in the 7th house. Now, the 7th house represents a lot of things. It's the public enemy, it's our enemy, it's the suspect, but it's also the legal situations that we face in life. It can represent lawyers, and so it goes further than just suspects and victims and stuff like that. Now, in Gemini, it's very much to do with communications and media and stuff like that. The media and Mercury ruling Gemini, these two, they're both related to each other. The media went into overdrive. Facebook went off. Social media went off. The public enemy, the cop, immediately was recorded, and that's very, very easy to see with this here. Photography, Venus, media, or just people standing side by side. People filmed the whole thing. And then the media got on the bandwagon and just turned it into a circus, starting connecting dots to Trump and doing all sorts of things. Now, I'm not going to get into that. I don't want to get hated on. So it's interesting to me that this Gemini, there's some very heavy Gemini here, because it's, very relative to what we are hearing, perceiving, and believing as well. Back to... She goes. She'll do anything to interrupt my videos, honestly. So this is Rodney King again. Now, look at his 7th house, the public enemy. Like, it's still Gemini, but we just have Mars there, which is just angry. So it just brought about violence. And the Sun is right down there in the 3rd house. So it was sort of like, just film it, talk about it, cause riots and everything, but no real change occurred because of the anger. This Mars here, there was nothing else. There was only, luckily there was a person videoing it. If it was 2020, there could have been 100 people videoing it. But anyway, I believe that this Mars here in Gemini it just didn't help it quite it didn't help it at all cut the problem out. Now, interestingly, again, Mars is at 14 degrees, but it's trining, so 120 degrees away. So there's Mars from the Moon at 14 degrees. So the Moon is responsible for all of our emotions, and it moves so fast, so we all emote very quickly, as we can tell by looking at the news every day. It's actually no wonder that the police got away with this trine here, 14 to 14, in the sign, the justice sign of Libra. There was no justice for Rodney King at that point in time. There would have been later, as there was, but at that point there wasn't, because of this smooth transition between this violence and the emotions of people at the time. Here we have George Floyd's again, and Mars, which I was just talking about before, is at 8 degrees and making a very tight sextile, which is actually quite an easy aspect, to Uranus. Uranus is sudden, unexpected change and events, and moving forward into the future with new goals in mind. Changing humanity is all about, that's Uranus. So it's good to see Mars connecting with Uranus in this instance, in my opinion, especially being from the 3rd house there, because it's like the rioting and the initially the aggressiveness and violence that's come from the police that went over to the rioting, it may actually make a sudden change. And I'm seeing a few things, it's hard to know what's real and what isn't, especially when we have all this Gemini stuff. We've really got to be careful with our information and misinformation. But I do see that I think that this is going to push us into further change. And also it being 30 years later exactly, and Saturn being in Aquarius again, we've come a full 30 years away from Rodney King's time. Now, what I was going to say is, if we look at this moon, I can't get my drawing thing, 14 degrees again, but it's in the 8th house and it's in Cancer. So in the water sign of Cancer, the emotion is deeper. It's in its own sign. It's not just about the justice of the police and versus Rodney King like it was in the other chart. This is about the emotion of everybody. It's something that emotionally triggered a lot of people, everybody all over the world, including some policemen and including the people that actually charged these people. And as you'll notice if you read more and more, the people that have done the really bad things that we keep seeing, pushing over old people, oh my goodness, pushing old people over and killing them and doing all sorts of stuff, these people are getting caught and getting in trouble. And I believe that it's helpful that the moon was in Cancer. The care factor is a lot higher than when the moon's in Libra. Again, I'm not talking about natal charts, so please don't think if you've got a Libran moon that I don't think you care as much as somebody with a Cancer moon. That's not true at all. There's no aspect. Well, there's a very, very loose trine. Let's look here. Mars. It's not going to show us because I lowered the orbs. Mars being at 8 degrees here, and then the moon being at 14. 8 plus 6 is 14, so that's a 6-degree orb. So there is a connection between the moon and Mars like there was in the other chart, but it's a trine, the same as the other chart. But now it's between the 3rd house, discussions, communication, changing things, and the 8th house, changing things about death and killing through violence of this Mars. So between the 3rd and the 8th house, I like the look of that. It's like no more killing, literally. Saying it. You could write it there. No more killing. And that's what this would represent, because the 3rd house here is talking, communicating, discussing what's going on, and the 8th house is killing and death. So it's really intriguing to look at the similarities and the differences between these two charts, some 30 years apart, 29 years apart. But there's something that I can say right now, and also, while I'm going to say that, see Chiron here, the wounded healer, is very, very powerful. It's right in the midpoint at 8 between Mars and Uranus. So the wounded healer is going to come and do something about this as well. Things will change. We're further along in time. We're not living back then like we used to. But we're not living in the days where they, 200 years ago or longer, where they treated all sorts of people like slaves and just like shit. Just treated people like shit just because that was their mentality back then. So thank God for Uranus, because if we didn't know about it, we didn't have it, I don't know how far we would get ahead. But before I finish up, I know I've been talking for a long time. There's plenty of other things we could look at in here. Obviously, I could spit out a whole ton of keywords and things and bombard you with information, but really, I think the most important thing is to note that this is a cyclic event, just the same as the coronavirus was also a cyclic event that came from when the Spanish flu was here. This is the same thing. Every event in history that is huge like this has a planetary exactation. Maybe that's a new word. You know, Saturn could be anywhere in this chart, but to have two charts of the same incidences have the same position of one planet is really pretty out there. It's what I love about astrology. So before I go, I'm going to show you Saturn throughout history, just briefly, and how it correlates with racism and racial violence and all of those other things. So bear with me. I've got Saturn moving through the signs from 1919 to 1929. It'd be good if it went back to 1900, because that's actually when Saturn was just about in Aquarius again. So if we look here, Saturn was in Capricorn in 1929 to 1932 and then moved into Aquarius. So 30 years before then is 1900. The 1900s is when, now I'll just get this right, I'm going to find a page actually to show you. So just familiarize yourself with this. So Saturn moves into all these signs on all these different dates. It's great to find these things because you can look up events in history and match them together. So we're looking at Saturn in Aquarius, obviously. Well, Capricorn, then Aquarius. This one's a good one. It was in Capricorn, went all the way back to Sagittarius, back into Capricorn, and then into Aquarius. Wow, that lasted ages. Okay. So I know you're only seeing a bit of a page here, but the segregation era began in 1900 to 1939. The Civil Rights Act of 1964. That's what I want to have a look at. So in 1900, things started happening. So we're going to move through and, find when Saturn was in Aquarius, February 23rd, 1932 to August 13, 1932, then 32 to 35. So let's have a look around 1932. Hattie Wyatt became the first woman elected to the US Senate. Here we go. Joint Committee on National Recovery formed to represent African Americans during the first 100 days of President Franklin Roosevelt's administration. So 1933, so exactly the same time period, Saturn in Aquarius, there started to become a teeny bit of equality. Teeny bit. The next one, Aquarius, 62 to 64. 64. 64. So, the most important one is the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Oh, that's interesting. Okay, so it began at the end of Saturn in Aquarius until when it actually happened, Saturn moved into Pisces. So early degrees of Pisces, 1, 2 degrees of Pisces, then retrograded back into Aquarius which would have been retrograded back to 29, which is exactly what is happening with us right now, but in Capricorn. So each time we have something different, it coincides very closely with these cycles. And I'm sure we could go further. Well, I know we can go further because there's Saturn in Aquarius, February 6, 1991 to May 20, 1993. And Rodney King was beaten early May 1993. So that's interesting. When you find these types of things, it's always really good to have a look. So here's the most recent one now, March 21st to July 1st. July 2nd, it will go back into Capricorn at 29 degrees until mid-December. Then it's going to go back to Aquarius and then go away for another 30 years. Thank God. Because it has not been pleasant this time around. But in saying all that, it's important and relevant to have these cycles, and as hard and as horrible and as authoritative and dictative Saturn can be, the further we go, the more it progresses and the more things will change. So I thought that was really interesting to see the cycles work like that. Like I said, everything has a cycle. You can pick anything and you'll find that it falls into the exact cycle. Wars, I've done many videos on them, but wars are always during a Saturn-Pluto cycle, which is why many astrologers thought that this year there would be another war because we have a Saturn-Pluto conjunction. This time it's just a war on ourselves and a war on the whole world, and actually it's more based on fear and death. Anyway, I could talk forever about all that crap. So there we go. This is a really good page, drstanley.com. And then just go and look at your history. Check out when all these things happened. You'll be amazed at how it works like that. That's the end of that video. I am very sorry to George Floyd's family. I'm glad the police have been arrested. I feel deep in my heart that this will change. I hope there's no more violence. This stuff needs to end. We all know it. In 2020, it's time to move forward and get past that. So let's just pray and hope that the police, the government, and everybody does do what they have to do. I think it's going to happen. It's terrible that it was at the cost of George Floyd's life. Absolutely despicable. And the things that I'm seeing and that we're seeing at the moment, police pushing over and killing old people, old men, old ladies. It's out of hand. It's got to stop. But I think that's what this year's all about. I think it's a matter of going inward, understanding what's important, realizing how to value each other, ourselves, and just one love. You know, we all matter. George Floyd mattered. I matter. You matter. We all matter. Hating on each other, hating on strangers, fighting with everybody, it is not going to get us anywhere. One love, one heart, peace. Love you guys. Take care.